Guess what day it is?
Oh,
It's French Fry Day, it's French Fry Day, so grab your fries and say hooray! David French is here to play on French Fry Day. It's French Fry Day.
David French, welcome back.
Thanks so much for having me.
I am always looking forward to these conversations every month, and it's always a dilemma for me as the month goes by to figure out what exactly am I going to talk to you about, because there's so much happening, and there's craziness in Florida with Disney and DeSantis. The Ukraine conflict has taken on new dimensions. Inflation is out of control. The 2022 midterms are upon us here soon, and all the primary battles. But what really caught my attention is the fact that on Monday, this coming Monday, which will be actually after people are listening to this, the Supreme Court is hearing oral arguments in a big case called Kennedy versus Bremerton School District.
Yeah.
I'll confess, I have not listened to the latest Advisory Opinions podcast, so I don't know if you guys have covered this already. But
Yeah, we talked about this months ago, back at the CERT stage, and we're going to talk about it again because it's a fascinating case.
Right.
I mean, there are layers here, Skye.
There are layers of which I don't understand them all, obviously, which is why you're here. Let's give the general layout for our audience. Joseph Kennedy is a high school coach from the Pacific Northwest, I believe, and he prays with his football players at a public school.
Right.
There's some nuance there that I'm skipping over.
There's a lot of nuance there. Yeah. So it might be more.
Lay out why this is going to the Supreme Court. What's the conflict?
Yeah. So essentially the issue here is you have a football coach who used to, so he would pray, quote, by himself, but then students gathered around him, and then he would pray sort of with students, like after a football game, pray with students, maybe deliver a few words. And the school, for Establishment Clause reasons, asked him to, don't lead people in prayer, right? Don't lead prayer with a group of students. And so what he wanted to do was have the ability to sort of go by himself after the football game to some spot on the field and pray, say by himself. Can I do that? And it devolved into a big time dispute over under what circumstances, and the facts of the case are really complicated. So I want to make it as simple as possible. But under what circumstances can a football coach go to a part of the field after a game and pray, and it just be his expression? In other words, his religious expression, and not clothed with the authority of the state. And so the real issue here, what is the line between when a prayer is a football coach's private expression and when is a prayer part of the football coach's job? And if it's part of the football coach's job, right, then this is K through 12, then it's going to be violating the Establishment Clause under current jurisprudence. If it's part of the coach's just private expression, then it's going to be constitutional. And the reason why I said there are layers here is that, this is taking place against a backdrop of an enormous dispute that we're having around the country about whether or not a public K through 12 teacher sort of even has their own free speech rights. And it's coming up in the context of anti-CRT bills. It's coming up in the context of pronouns. And while this is not going to really decide that issue, it's going to get a lot more attention than I think that it would have gotten otherwise, because you're talking about it's going to be a Supreme Court case where a public employee is on the grounds of the public school and is engaged in what the public employee says is private expression. And so is it private expression? Now, is it private expression if students see him praying and come pray with him? In other words, he's not leading them. They just come next to him and pray. Is it still private expression? Or when people in the crowd see him pray and then come pray with him, is that still private expression? So it's a really as I said, there are layers here, and I didn't do justice to all the nuances and all of the facts of the case. With all due apologies to the lawyers who are listening to this, but that we hit at the core of the issue.
Okay, to the point of context, let's take a step back and help me and help us understand the jurisprudence up to this point, because this is not the first case that's come to the courts on the issue of prayer and public employees in public schools, and even with
Right.
coaches. So, yeah, there's a lot of nuance to this particular case because it's not exactly the same as a coach leading his or her players in a prayer
Right.
before or after a game at a public school.
Right.
But that has been brought before the courts before. And give a little bit of background, there's this really interesting article that just came out today in Christianity Today called Why We Fight About Football Prayers. I don't know if you've
Yeah.
seen that.
I haven't seen that yet.
It's by Paul Putz or Putz, Putz, and Daniel Bennett. And they kind of give the history of the intermingling of football and Christianity in America and
Yeah.
Fellowship of Christian Athletes. There's this one interesting quote they have. It says, by 1957, prayer in college and high school sports was so common that when the Fellowship of Christian Athletes published a pamphlet on prayer in sports, they described it as, quote, normal procedure, end quote.
Right.
The question was not if coaches and athletes should pray, but rather how. So, and I know in the South and a lot of parts of the country where football is basically religion, these things are intertwined. So explain some of the history and how the courts have ruled on this practice over the years that has led now to this case with Kennedy.
Yeah. So I think the best way to describe it is that football, there's an enormous amount of in any sort of healthy football player coach relationship. There's an enormous amount of mentoring that goes on. This is it's a pretty darn brutal sport that requires some physical courage to play. So there's a lot of mentoring, there's a lot of inspiring, there's a lot of motivating. And when you combine mentoring, inspiring, motivating in a deeply religious country, and especially in a deeply religious region of a deeply religious country, the South, you're going to get a lot of faith and faith adjacent elements. I mean, this is just, it's just going to happen. It's just going to happen. And so what has ended up happening is that this has been caught up in, this issue has been caught up in a long line of cases involving to what extent can religion be in public schools. And the rough settlement of the dispute and the debate has gone kind of along these lines. If a coach is clothed with the authority of the state in their role as an employee of the state, the idea that the coach can lead any kind of religious ceremony, religious expression, religious prayer, that's going to be a no-go in the same way that it'd be a no-go, like if your history teacher began class with a Bible reading. In other words, so in what capacity are you operating? Okay. But if you have outside organizations that say like a Fellowship of Christian Athletes that reserve a certain time in a classroom on an equal basis as anyone else sort of in the community, a community group can reserve time in a classroom, well, then students can go to that. And it's led by people outside. Can the football coach in their own personal capacity participate in events outside of school? Yes, absolutely. So a lot of it is in what capacity is the football coach? In what capacity is he praying? Is it as a private individual, off school grounds, off school time? That's pretty clear. Is it as a public official during school hours while operating as an employee of the school? That's also pretty clear. So you have the clear no and the clear yes. But as we know, Skye, the clear no's and the clear yeses get towards a gray middle. And so the other thing that ends up happening is that often when you have students who choose to do things and they're in a deeply religious school or a school in a deeply religious place, then the students will choose often, 95 out of 100, say, members of a big football team. Let's say 45 out of 50 members of a big football team. They might go to FCA, right? And then they might bring a lot of that FCA back into school. So long as all of that student initiated and student led and student directed, that's not going to be a problem so long as it isn't disruptive. But then what if you had your linebackers coach was at FCA and your linebackers coach is in the locker room and several dozen students ask the linebacker coach to pray? So a lot of this, you have this one kind of natural interaction off school grounds that people want to bring on school grounds. And that's where sort of the kind of the complexity of human relationships leads to a lot of the blurring of the lines. And this is a case about the blurring of the lines.
One of the things that complicates this is when you get outside the courtroom and the strict interpretation of the law, you have cultural dynamics.
Yes.
A lot of these cases have emerged from the South, from that part of the country, as you mentioned, that football's huge and is very religious, and these things are intertwined, and you have significant majorities of the public have no problem with a coach praying with their students, or
Would love it. They'd
right.
love it. Yeah.
And see it as a benefit. They want their kid mentored by that coach who's a devout Christian or whatever it might be. And the courts have stepped in and said, yeah, that may be the case, but our purpose here and the Constitution's purpose is to protect the minority people in that community who don't want that.
Right.
What's interesting about this case now is it's not in the Bible Belt. It's in the Pacific Northwest. It's in a part of the country where, generally speaking, a more conservative Bible-oriented Christianity is in the minority.
Right.
And the argument that was used to shoot down these coach-led prayers in prior cases, this First Amendment argument for the protection of religious minorities, is now kind of getting flipped on its head because the religious minority who's being protected is the religious coach.
Right.
So how does that change the argument here from what we've seen in the past when these coach-initiated prayer kind of things have come up?
It's a legal matter. It shouldn't really change it much, because the question is going to be, in what capacity? The core question is going to be, in what capacity was he operating when he prayed? And so whether he's super popular or super despised, that question is still sort of the same. It's just a difference of atmospherics. And what I'd say is, also, it's pretty well acknowledged that if you're a teacher, even when you're teaching, you can have a cross necklace, or when you're in the lunchroom and you can pray in front of your meal, right? You can bow your head and silently pray in front of your meal. These kinds of things are established as sort of private religious expressions that aren't going to be, that are going to pass muster constitutionally. And so is this more like bowing your head and praying before a meal? Or is this more like going ahead and just leading a group at the 50-yard line? and my thought is the Supreme Court is going to say this is more like bowing your head and praying before a meal. And there's some reasons for this. I think that the Supreme Court is due for a correction back in the direction of public employees on free speech.
Okay.
If I can get pretty nerdy for a second.
Go for it.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm gonna get kind of nerdy. For a long time, the doctrine, free speech doctrine for public employees, was relatively clear. It was under a case called Pickering, and under the Pickering test, if a public employee was speaking or on a matter of public concern, they would have free speech rights when they're speaking on a matter of public concern. And now, not unlimited. You had balancing tests. It got complicated. But then a case came forward called Garcetti v. Sabalas. And essentially what the Garcetti case said was, or asked was, does Pickering apply when a public employee is speaking as a public employee, not as a private citizen, but as part of their job? Okay. And the Supreme Court said, no, when a public employee is speaking as part of their job, just This is my job, even when I'm talking, and I'm talking on a matter of public concern. No free speech rights. None.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, to apply this to public education, if I'm a school teacher in the classroom and I'm teaching history, I do not have freedom of speech in that capacity.
No, none. Okay,
Okay.
but there's where it gets gnarly, so to speak. So in the course of the, back and forth on the court, it was raised, well, wait a minute. What about teaching and scholarship? Because, aren't we sort of preparing students to live in a pluralistic society? And especially at the higher education level, isn't there a First Amendment interest in even a public university teacher teaching with academic freedom? Isn't that traditionally encompassed within our First Amendment jurisprudence? And so what the Supreme Court did in Garcetti v. Sabalas was say, we're not applying our ruling to teaching and scholarship, and we're not applying our ruling to teaching and scholarship. We're just leaving teaching and scholarship to the side. Okay. We're just taking teaching and scholarship and we're just pushing it to the side. So that just sort of threw all of the lower courts into a state of confusion. Do professors have a right, of public university professors? Do they still have academic freedom rights or First Amendment rights protected by the Constitution in their classroom at public universities? What about K through 12 teachers? And the way the law is kind of shaken out is that public university professors, according to lower courts, have lots of rights, and K through 12 teachers have very few. Very few.
Okay.
And so that's why I say, so it's become really an interesting question in the context of anti-CRT laws and things like this, because state legislatures are passing laws binding K through 12 teachers that would be struck down immediately if they applied to public university teachers.
Right.
Right. Well, okay. In one sense, people say, well, K through 12's kids, and public university, they're teaching adults. Well, there's a huge difference between K and 12. Right?
There
K,
is.
you're having trouble standing in line. 12, a lot of them by the end of their senior year, they're voters. They're 18 years old. They're adults and they're voters in the eyes of the law. And so is it actually the case that the line is that bright? And I don't know that this case is going to shine a whole lot of light on that question. I kind of doubt it will, except to this extent. I think that there's such a stark line now between university professors and K through 12 teachers that governments are overextending into the control of K through 12 teachers. And I think they're due for a little bit of a brushback pitch from the Supreme Court.
Okay, but how does this relate then? I mean, what you're describing is the First Amendment's freedom of speech right. But how does this get complicated when you start talking about the Establishment Clause when it comes to religious speech?
Well, what it is the complicator is, so I have a free exercise clause right, and I have a free speech right that's implicated by prayer. So both free exercise and free speech are implicated by prayer. But the school has an Establishment Clause interest. It has an interest in defending the Establishment Clause. So the question then is, this gets to, there's going to be a lot of judgment calls here, Skye. What is the line? How much of a benefit of the doubt are we going to give to the school saying this is him speaking as us versus to the teacher saying this is me speaking as me?
And is there any objective way to define that? Like when... I mean, it sounds to me, from my casual reading of this case, it sounds to me like this coach has basically done everything he possibly can to make sure that his expression of prayer is not confused as an official capacity activity of being a coach at this public school.
Right.
So
except he wants to stay on the field.
Right. I guess that's the only last thing he could do is remove himself from the school property as well in order to do this. But then does that become the objective standard that you can express your religious convictions as freely as you wish, but not on school property?
See, that's why I think he's going to win and that's why I think he should win, frankly, because I think we cannot take human beings, these teachers, K through 12 teachers, human beings, American citizens, and As soon as they walk onto the property of the school, they become sort of like TeachBot 9000, this state-controlled teaching drone that just speaks with the approved state speak,
Right.
and then doesn't become a citizen again really until they walk off the job and walk off school grounds, or are completely out of the sight of students, or that the various circumstances make it indisputable to anybody watching that what they're doing is them and them only. Like the easy case that for that would be a teacher praying but completely by themselves over their meal, so nobody's thinking of that as school speech. But that's a very constrained understanding, I believe, of citizens operating even as public employees. They're still citizens, and they still have First Amendment rights. They still have free exercise rights. And if they're behaving in a way that I believe is a reasonable, what can be construed reasonably as their private expression, they should win this case.
Okay. So I'm guessing if folks who are listening to this, majority of whom are probably Christians, are going to go, of course, David. Yeah. A Christian teacher praying before their lunch meal, or a Christian coach who wants to go to the corner of the field and pray before or after a game. Absolutely. This is ridiculous. We should allow it. We're Americans. This is a no-brainer. What happens when or if there is a Muslim teacher or a Muslim coach in Tennessee who decides he or she wants to pray before a match, a game, whatever, rolls out a little carpet on the edge of the football field, kneels privately and prays? Are people going to be as enthusiastic about defending that person's rights?
They should be. They should be.
Or what happens when the public school teacher is a Muslim and is committed to praying 5 times a day towards Mecca, and during a break between classes rolls out a prayer carpet and kneels and prays in the corner of their classroom, and some students see this? Is that going to be okay in Tennessee?
It has to be. It has to be. So this is the thing that where the rubber really meets the road in the American social compact. There is no viable legal doctrine that says free speech for me and not for thee.
Right.
Free exercise for me and not for thee. Although big parts of the right are testing that right now. I mean, the same right that said about Hobby Lobby that, hey, look, they have a religious free exercise right to not provide certain forms of contraceptives to their employees. The same right that said that Masterpiece Cake Shop doesn't have to bake a custom cake to celebrate a gay wedding is now the same right that's saying Disney needs to be punished for being too woke. Okay. You can't have it both ways there.
Right.
Or the same right that said, how dare San Antonio not let Chick-fil-A be in San Antonio International Airport, is now saying, we need to punish companies that are woke. You can't have it both ways. The rule is not that companies get free speech or individuals get free speech so long as you like that free speech. And so in a diverse, pluralistic society that respects individual liberty, you should expect to not just see expression that you disagree with, but you should also feel obligated to protect expression that you disagree with.
Obviously, I 100% agree with what you're saying, David, but aren't we witnessing an unveiling of real motivations here?
Oh, yes.
Because what's becoming clear to me is some people, especially on the right, who claim to be defending religious rights or religious liberty, when you drill down deep enough, what they're really upset about is not the infringement on their religious liberty. What they're really upset about is the religious diversity and pluralism of the modern United States.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's even a strain of thought on the far right that says that the Free Exercise Clause is intended to protect only Judeo-Christian religion.
Right. I've heard that one too.
Yeah. So that's an extreme sort of far right view. That
and Islam doesn't apply because they say it's not a religion, it's a political philosophy.
Or it's just not Judeo-Christian.
Right.
Yeah. And so that's an extreme fringe far right. But what's more common is something like this, because very few people are actually going to say, Christians should have more religious liberty than Muslims, or that conservative companies should have more free speech rights than progressive companies. Very few people will come out and just say that. What they'll say is, well, the San Antonio Chick-fil-A case is different. So they'll, if a Disney store was being barred from San Antonio International Airport, we'd rally to Disney's side, but this is a special tax district. That's different. And so people try to endlessly parse cases that are actually very much alike to try to make them seem not alike. And you can always see the pattern, because it always, when people do that, the pattern works out like this. My side always wins.
What a coincidence.
Your side always loses. So, for example, with cancel culture argument, the cancel culture argument where, say, a James Damore from Google was fired for writing this thing about, this manifesto about why women might not be, there might not be as many women programmers. And here's some things Google can do to bring more women programmers without discriminating on the basis of sex. And he was fired. And everyone on the right said, Google, that's cancel culture.
Mm-hmm.
But then Colin Kaepernick kneels before the national anthem, and Donald Trump, the president of the United States, says, fire him and fire those players. And the right was like, yeah, go get them. And you say, well, wait a minute, James, you just were saying about James Damore. Well, that's different. He's not kneeling in front of the flag, well, and of course, every case has different facts, but cases have common principles that apply to those facts. And, when it comes to religious liberty, and when it comes to religious liberty and free speech, these common principles should lock in, even when the facts are often different from case to case, unless the facts get kind of extremely different.
Okay, last thing on this story. You've already said you think that Kennedy, the coach, should win in Kennedy v. Bremerton School District. Do you think this is a split decision on the court, or do you expect there to be a significant majority in favor of Kennedy, given some of the court's other religious liberty rulings where they've not been really close calls?
I'm going to say it'll be 7-2 or 8-1 with a narrow opinion.
Meaning? And what does that narrow opinion mean?
So a narrow opinion is an opinion that basically says, under the facts of this case, where he walks off to one side, where,
okay. So it won't have sweeping implications for massive changes in the way public schools and religion interact.
Right. So, often when you have a case, you have a choice between a shove and a nudge when it comes to the law. So are you shoving it in one direction, or are you nudging it in one direction? And what the Supreme Court has tended to do with religious liberty for more than a decade is to use overwhelming majorities for incremental nudges. So religious liberty is on a more than 10-year winning streak at the Supreme Court.
You've talked about this before, and even recently I read a piece from a Christian activist arguing that religious liberty has never been under greater threat. And yet, from my reading and from talking to you, I know, and looking at the court cases, these are not close decisions. They are very wide, either unanimous or 8-1 kind of decisions. It doesn't feel like religious liberty is under great threat.
The way I would say it, and I wrote a piece, I think this was the title, if I remember correctly. The citadel is strong, but the cannon fire is real. In other words, the walls of religious liberty are very high and strong. But that doesn't mean that there aren't people lobbing cannonballs at it. It's just that they always bounce off. And in a weird way, every cannonball imagine a world where in a siege where the cannonball actually toughened the wall if it bounced off.
Sure. That's what Nassim Taleb calls anti-fragile. It gets stronger and stronger the more it's tested.
Right. Exactly. So each Supreme Court case challenging religious liberty, the challenge to it is real, right? I mean, otherwise it wouldn't be a Supreme Court case.
Right.
But then the Supreme Court rules 7-2, 8-1, 9-0. I mean, one of the most contentious cases of the last term was a 9-0 case involving a Catholic adoption agency. And now it wasn't a huge win for religious liberty, but it moved the ball down the field. To use a football metaphor, since we started with football, you're getting a lot of first downs.
Yeah.
You're not getting a lot of touchdowns, but it's first down, first down, first down, first down. And then ultimately that leads to touchdowns. But For more than 10 years, these cases have been won on pretty narrow grounds with pretty wide majorities.
Which is a reassuring fact that, at least in the realm of constitutional law, religious liberty is not eroding,
No, it's getting stronger.
despite what all the crazy activists are trying to make us think.
Well, I'll just end with this, just to put this in perspective. I was in a room 16 years ago, 2006, and I used to run a litigation department for Alliance Defending Freedom, where I worked on education litigation from coast to coast. And we outlined a series of goals. This is what we want to accomplish this is what we want to accomplish at the Supreme Court. And these are the doctrines we want to establish and the kinds of cases we want to win. I think if I'm remembering those 06 meetings correctly, we've hit every target, every single goal. This was our wish list of how we can use the courts to further solidify protections for free speech and religious freedom. And we were not defeated in any one of those things. We made immense gains in all of them.
So let's not freak out.
Correct.
Okay, let's move on to the other thing I really wanted to talk about, which is a piece you wrote earlier this month called "How the Fight Over Critical Race Theory Became a Religious War." We've talked about CRT on the Holy Post a number of times. We've had experts come on and talk about it. We've had guests argue, why it's become this boogeyman. I thought you did a great job in unpacking this, but let's begin where you begin, which is as a student at Harvard in the 1980s, where you first encountered this horrible menace on Western civilization known as critical race theory. What was it in the 1980s when you encountered it?
Yeah. So I get to law school. I came from a small town in Kentucky, went to a small Christian college, and then I walk into HLS in, don't make me too old, Skye, 91.
Sorry, 91, although the critical race theories you read came from the 1980s.
Yes, correct.
Yes.
So I confront, most of my teachers were what we called crits, critical legal theorists. So critical race theory is a form of critical theory. Critical legal theory is a form of critical theory. And some of my crit professors were critical race theorists. And so I read some of the initial founding texts of critical race theory, including, how's this, Skye, for an extremely provocative title? Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex, a Black Feminist Critique of Anti-Discrimination Doctrine, Feminist Theory, and Anti-Racist Politics.
That sounds very academic.
It was very academic. It's a 1989 Law Review article by Kimberly Crenshaw that really kind of solidified the notion of intersectionality by analyzing 3 employment law cases. And I read Derek Bell's book, Faces at the Bottom of the Well, The Permanence of Racism. Read a ton of critical legal theory. I read a ton of critical race theory. And I remember it well. And here's what I remember. There were things about it that I found interesting and provocative. There were things about it I found disturbing and troubling. There were people who were connected to the crit movement who were deeply intolerant, and some were not. But I never thought I'm reading a threat to my faith.
Yeah.
Right. So I thought I'm reading interesting academic theories that some extremists have taken, I think, way too far, and some people have applied in interesting ways. And let's deal with it on those terms. I never thought, I'm reading something that contradicted, was in any way a threat to my faith.
Okay, we'll put a link to your article in our show notes, but in it you have a graph that kind of tells the whole story. It's a graph of Google Trends for the search term critical race theory.
Yeah.
And the graph dates back to 2004, and it is basically a flat line. I mean, you barely see a blip on that line. It is at virtually zero until, I'm guessing, late 2020, early 2021, and then it just explodes. And that's what it feels like. I mean, you first encountered critical race theory in the early 90s. the theory itself dates back to the 80s. Most of us have been inundated with messages about CRT for the last 24 months or so. And if it's such a huge threat to society, to the Constitution, and to Christianity, you would think that it wouldn't be a brand new invention. But like we would have heard about this danger before. But
Right.
for most of us, it appeared out of nowhere in less than 2 years ago.
Yeah.
So what changed? Why did this go from a theory that a legally trained person like yourself would be exposed to, but most of us have no awareness of it at all, to becoming the single greatest threat to everything God made holy and dear?
Okay. Well, there's a couple of things going on at once. One is there is a actual phenomenon that, and I didn't come up with this term, Matt Iglesias wrote about it at Vox.com back, in 2019. He called it the Great Awakening. So this was the sharp liberalization of white progressives. So along a number of spectrums, but including on race issues. So white progressives, a very discrete subgroup of Americans, became dramatically more liberal in the late 20 teens and to the point where they became more left of your median. The median white Democrat moved well to the left of your median black Democrat on race issues,
Which is
so they're
really fascinating.
very fascinating. Very fascinating. So along with the Great Awakening, again, Iglesias' term, came some real intolerance, kind of similar to the intolerance that I faced when I was in law school. When I was in law school, there would be booing and hissing and shouting down and that kind of behavior. People tried to get people's jobs canceled. We didn't have a term, cancel culture, for it at the time, but it was that same phenomenon.
Yeah.
It's that intolerance that I referenced. So you begin to have this awakening and the cancel culture stuff happening. But then also on the right, something else happens as well. And that is rather CRT, the definition of CRT is intentionally changed. Okay. So it is intentionally changed. I'm going to read to you a tweet, a couple of tweets from a guy named Chris Rufo, who's a Manhattan Institute senior fellow and one of the guys sort of at the point of the spear on this anti-CRT fight. And he says, we have successfully frozen their brand, critical race theory, into the public conversation and are steadily driving up negative perceptions. We will eventually turn it toxic as we put all of the various cultural insanities under that brand category. The goal is to have the public read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think critical race theory. We have decodified the term and will recodify it to annex, and this is the key, to annex the, quote, entire range of cultural constructions that are unpopular with Americans. So what does that mean in plain English? It means that there was an intentional effort on parts of the right where if you heard anything about race that you didn't like, unpopular, you don't like it, that's critical race theory. Okay. Whether or not it is critical race theory, whether or not it has anything to do with critical race theory, that's critical race theory.
Okay. Can we pause for a second?
Yeah.
Because as a communicator, on the one hand, I admire the strategy because we know that things are going to go much farther if you can make them simple. Right. And so they've redefined CRT, critical race theory, and they've made it a depository for everything about race and culture that the right doesn't like can now be easily communicated with the shorthand CRT, critical race theory. I mean, the left did this brilliantly when they were trying to make the argument for same-sex marriage, and they changed the language of that discussion around to become one of marriage equality. And it would, the branding of that was brilliant, and it really fueled some of the support for it. And here you have the opposite going on, where they're taking everything they don't like about the progressive left on the issue of race, and they're rebranding it. That in and of itself isn't what bothers me.
Yeah.
What bothers me is now they have taken essentially everything that relates to racial justice and convinced a lot of people that it is a direct threat to not only America, but Christianity itself.
Christianity. So you have this. So two things are happening at once. One, you have this sort of academic, philosophical, theological argument that goes on about CRT, the actual thing CRT,
Mm-hmm.
and it's whether it is compatible or not compatible with Christianity. So imagine you have like this faculty lounge academic argument about theological argument about CRT. And a number of voices have said CRT, the actual theory CRT, is got some real problems and is incompatible with the Christian faith. So this message gets implanted with a bunch of Christians that says CRT is incompatible with the Christian faith. Well, but what's CRT? Well, then that's when the Rufo thing comes in. It's anything I don't like about race.
Right.
So all of a sudden, if you're like a white evangelical conservative, you have built bulletproof armor against being challenged on matters of race. Because when you hear an issue that when you hear something you don't like about race, it challenges you. It disrupts your pre-existing worldview a bit, or your understanding of American history, or understanding American sociology. If it upsets you, if it's not popular with you, that's CRT. Well, what's the problem with CRT? It's not Christian.
Right.
And so you have built a bulletproof armor against being challenged by ideas that you might not be familiar with or you might not like about race. And what does this mean in the real world? Well, take my own home county, for example. In my own home county, coalitions of parents have challenged the book Ruby Bridges Goes to School under the state's anti-CRT law. The book Ruby Bridges Goes to School by Ruby Bridges, about her desegregating schools in Louisiana. It's history. It's history. And why did and they also challenged the Norman Rockwell painting, The Thing We All Live With, which depicts Ruby Bridges going to school, and facing racial slurs and all of that. Again, history. Why would they challenge that under an anti-CRT law? Well, they're applying the Rufo definition.
Anything I don't like about race is CRT.
Exactly.
Yeah. There was a horrible story about the Senate in Texas, I believed. It was kind of all for theater. It didn't get through the rest of the legislature, but they passed a bill trying to ban MLK speeches from public school curriculum. And same argument. It's anything I don't like about race, we can ban. Okay, on the Christian side of this, though, you cite in your piece an article written by Neil Shenvi and Pat Sawyer in the Gospel Coalition, where they basically argue that CRT is a counter worldview. It's a meta-narrative that is incompatible with the meta-narrative of the Bible or the meta-narrative of Orthodox Christianity. And that's why Christians need to oppose CRT, because it's this all-consuming thing that defines your identity. It defines a struggle. It has an alternative vision of salvation. And I know folks who read that article. I've talked to numerous Christians who have bought into this idea that the reason we need to be against CRT is because it is an all-consuming worldview. Why do you think that's not correct?
Well, I know critical theorists who are Christians for whom it is not an all-consuming worldview. It is a academic theory of American law and life that purports to explain why and how racism persists. Okay. And so let me just sort of deal with a couple of aspects. So, for example, Shenvi writes, and Shenvi and Sawyer write, and it's a thoughtful article. I would recommend that people read it because I like to include the best expression of the other side's point of view when you're talking about like an interesting argument. He says, this is Shenvi and Sawyer, is our fundamental problem sin, in which case we all equally stand condemned before a holy God, or is our fundamental problem oppression, in which case members of dominant groups are tainted by guilt in a way that members of subordinate groups are not? I don't think that's necessarily a fair description of CRT. Because, for example, if you're talking about oppression, you are talking about sin.
Right.
And CRT doesn't really talk about members of dominant groups as having sort of guilt, but they do talk a lot about responsibilities. And there's a difference between guilt. There's a difference between guilt. I am guilty of what my Confederate ancestors did. No, versus say, I belong to an institution that inflicted harm on American society, and I have a responsibility to ameliorate the effects of injustice. Those are different things. Also, they talk about this concept of, is our identity primarily defined in terms of our vertical relationship to God, or primarily in terms of horizontal power dynamics between groups of people? In that circumstance, the word primarily is doing a lot of work here, because really we have biblical commands to act justly that require us to consider not just our vertical relationship with God, but also our horizontal relationship with our neighbors. And so it's both.
Yeah. And when I put my pastor hat on, this drives me up the wall, because what you see again and again and again throughout the scriptures, both the Old Testament prophets and the words of Jesus repeatedly, is this refusal to separate the vertical from the horizontal. They are always linked. Isaiah 58. Yes. God says he rejects the fasting of his people because they treat one another unjustly. Jesus says, if you do not forgive those who've wronged you, my heavenly Father will not forgive you. If you're going to make an offering at the altar and there remember your brother has something against you, first go be reconciled to your brother, then come and offer your gift at the altar. It goes on and on. Even Paul talks about how we've been reconciled to one another through the cross and made into one new man, and then together been reconciled to God. So there's always the horizontal and vertical linked, and you can't separate the two. But getting back to their argument, it feels a little bit like a version of nut picking to me, which is, it's a term that's getting thrown around now, where you take the most extreme outliers of a particular group and use them as an exemplar of what the whole group is like. And I have no doubt that there are probably some adherents of CRT who take it to an extreme where they view everybody through the lens of race, or everybody through their group identity as oppressor or oppressed. But that's not the normal way CRT is engaged. And the moment you take that extreme view, you can argue that, yeah, this is an unhealthy form of identification and vision of the world, and it does contradict Christianity. But you can do that with, my goodness, anything. So I'm thinking, like, in the economic realm, I'm a consumer. I buy things. That's part of my identity in this world. That is not, in my view, an inherent contradiction to the gospel. Now, if the only or primary way I see myself is only as a consumer,
right,
then yeah, we have a contradiction with the gospel. Or, even nationally, I am an American citizen. I view myself that way. I carry an American passport. I would consider myself, a healthy patriot. But taken to an extreme, you have Christian nationalism, which only sees people as you're either a patriot or a traitor. And at that point, it crosses a line and becomes a false gospel. It becomes contrary to the Christian message. So is it a case that critics of CRT on the right, Christian critics, are just presenting an extreme version of CRT in order to build this straw man argument that it's opposed to the gospel? But the way it's appropriately employed, no, it's just a device or a tool for understanding race and society.
Yeah. So two things on that. One, there is such a thing as extremism, and I mean extremism, in the CRT world.
Sure.
Absolutely undeniable. And it's there. And sometimes it manifests itself in some pretty bad stuff. So for example, when I was back in my litigation days, a lot of the speech codes I litigated against were inspired by CRT, which there are strands of CRT that reject American classical liberalism. Now, if you think that's something confined to the left, let me introduce you to the integralist post-liberal right, which is rejecting American classical liberalism too.
Right.
But so absolutely. But there are also lots of Christian scholars who engage with and work with CRT. There's folks at Wheaton. There's folks all over the world, the Christian world, who engage with and work with critical theory through a Christian lens. And so, here's the way I'd put it, Skye. I would say that if you have any sort of academic or social theory or idea or secular ideology any one of them can be incompatible with Christianity when you push them into the dominant position in your life.
Right.
Any of them. And they'll be incompatible with Christianity in different kinds of specific ways, but they're all going to share in common that they have supplanted, they've become an idol, that they've become an idol. So there are all kinds of things that can become an idol. And can CRT become an idol? Heck yeah. Can Donald Trump become an idol? Heck yeah.
Right.
But, the fact that a whole bunch of Republicans stormed the Capitol on January 6th is not proof that Republicans can't be Christians. It is demonstration of how Christian nationalism can veer into insurrection and idolatry, but it is not a demonstration that Republicans can't be Christians. And so you have to be really careful about this stuff. And, one of the ways that I've phrased it is that at its extremes, now, what critical race theory does that I think is actually quite useful is it talks about how race is a social construct.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's very useful. And nothing at all about that idea is inconsistent with Christianity. In fact, it's quite consistent.
Right.
But it is absolutely the case that there in some CRT circles that socially constructed identity, once constructed, becomes central. And that's I think that's dangerous.
Well,
but again, is CRT incompatible with Christianity, or is an extremist manifestation like the extremist manifestations of a bunch of worldviews?
right. Well, the irony is you're absolutely correct. An extreme form of CRT can become idolatrous and draw someone away from the centrality of the gospel. But it appears to me in some circles, anti-CRT has become idolatrous and is drawing us away from the gospel. Toward the end of the article, you talk about the example of Grove City College, which is a Christian college in Pennsylvania. And there's a movement there from students, parents, alumni, and they've started this petition arguing that the college has drifted from its core Christian values and mission and is embracing CRT. And the evidence they cite is the fact that Jamar Tisby spoke at a chapel in 2020, that they had a video recording of Brian Stevenson's TED Talk, which is absolutely amazing, that everyone should see. They had Esau McCauley, our friend here from Wheaton, who's been on the show numerous times, to speak about his book, Reading While Black, and others. And like, they're just engaging thoughtful Christian leaders around questions of race and justice from a Christian point of view in a diverse society. And now that's being labeled CRT and being shut down.
If you've got a problem, if you're a Christian institution and you're saying Jamar Tisby or Esau McCauley are a threat to your Christian mission, I mean, that's a problem. And look, I don't agree with everything that Jamar says, but by golly, he's a thoughtful Christian man, and I want to hear from him, right? I want to hear from Jamar Tisby. I want to hear from Esau McCauley. These are thoughtful Christian men, and Christian institutions should covet the kinds of discourse that different Christians can bring to the race conversation. They should appreciate the diversity of views here, not try to shun them or believe that they're a threat to the Christian mission of the college. It's amazing stuff.
So put your prophet hat on a little bit, and where do you think this is going to go? Assuming we don't just abandon the CRT hysteria, what happens as this continues to ferment in the church and people continue to build this immunity against anything that's racial that they find uncomfortable? Where does this lead us?
Well, one is we have to acknowledge a reality that this is a fad. Okay, so that the anti-CRT movement does have a lot of the characteristics of a fad, and it's funny if you look at that same chart that I attached, it peaks like right around October 1, 2021, and then drops precipitously and is down closer to the more normal baseline level because other things have taken over for it. So, Chris Rufo has moved on and it talks a lot about the LGBT issue in schools now. And so part of this is faddish.
Is
But
it do you think it was faddish in response to Black Lives Matter and the George Floyd murder and the protests that even a lot of white Christians were getting involved? Like, was it an an autoimmune response from some of the white conservative America saying we can't have this racial awakening even in our communities? We got to shut this down, and CRT became a good bludgeon for that.
Well, it's weird because if you actually look at the numbers, there is a blip in the summer of 2020, but it's not till the fall of 2021, way after, more than a year after the George Floyd protests and riots. So there's a little in the summer of 2020, there's just a kind of a little short blip of interest in CRT. And then bam, it hits in like the late fall of 2021 and just dominates these Google search charts. And a lot of it is because, one of the characteristics of right-wing media, Skye, is that right-wing media is an absolute messaging machine.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that was right before some of the gubernatorial elections, like in Virginia, that were really fueling the CRT hysteria.
Mm-hmm. The Loudoun County school stories.
Right.
Yeah. So you had a big election coming up. You had a controversial school district. And then you had these activists here who are saying, this is a crisis and we have the solution. And it's these anti-CRT bills. And so it was a bit of a fad, but the effects are lingering. And to the extent that the effects linger, Skye, here's what really worries me, is that you're teaching millions. And I hate to separate this out like white evangelicals, but it's just the case that white evangelicals are a very distinct, different culture, subculture of the United States, in part because Sunday is one of the most segregated days of the year. But you're teaching millions of white evangelicals that challenging thoughts about race are un-Christian and woke.
Right.
And that is a dangerous message to send. It's essentially saying to millions of white evangelicals that unless a message about race is coming from someone you like and is pleasing to your ears, then be on guard. When the reality is, we should be walking into the race conversation, Skye, wide open. We should be walking in humbly and wide open because we're talking about one of the most complex, vexing, and frankly, tragic issues of all of the issues in the United States of America. And so we should be wide open to hearing thoughtful people, and not just thoughtful Christians, but thoughtful people on this issue. And instead, what this panic is teaching people to do is close up.
Yeah. What's frightening to me is it felt like for a while there was progress happening in white evangelical circles around exactly what you're describing: humility and walking into the conversation, listening, hearing from sisters and brothers of color and their experience in the church and what the churches of African-American churches and other churches have to say to the white church in America. There was a lot of that going on. And then the door just slammed shut really, really hard in the last couple of years. And there's a sense, I'm hearing it even from pastors, who are like, I can't talk about race anymore.
No. Yeah.
And even really safe voices like some of the ones you mentioned at the college, at that Christian college, like they're no longer okay. You can't.
Yeah.
And that's, wow. It's amazing how rapidly we've shifted into reverse.
I will tell you this, and this is a true facts, Skye. So in 2020, when there was this sort of breaking open, people's hearts broke when they saw the George Floyd video. It broke people's hearts. And when their hearts broke, they opened up and they wanted to hear. And you would see an enormous amount of openness to different conversations. And now it's not just closed, but it's closing in this incredibly toxic way where if you even signal openness, you are attacked viciously.
Right.
Just viciously. And so I have this really weird dichotomy, and I don't know if you experience this, where when I open Twitter, whenever I write about a race issue, it is like opening the gates of hell. It is just, reading my mentions and replies, and it's just horrible. But then I open my email inbox, and it's full of, I appreciate this. Thank you. I can't say anything publicly about this. I pastor a church and I can't talk about this. I mean, I've gotten that message so many times.
Yep.
I pastor a church, and if I talk about this, I might even lose my job. And so the private feedback, which says there's a lot of people still open, is and is encouraging. But I wish some of those private messages would be also out in public as well.
Yeah, I agree. I wonder if we might be seeing the beginnings of a new modernist fundamentalist divide, like happened 100 years ago in the American church, where prior to that division, there was a sense that a faithful Christian believed in the orthodox teachings of the church and was engaged in social good, right?
Yeah.
And ending slavery, child labor laws, vote for women, reforming criminal justice and prisons, all that was done by biblically faithful Christians. And then the modernist fundamentalist split came along and said, you either get to believe in the authority of Scripture or engage in social activism.
Right.
And so there were a lot of Bible believing Christians who were like, I can't do anything anymore about speaking out about social injustice or poverty because I'm going to be branded as a modernist and a heretic, and I can't do that anymore. And it feels like that's where we are on race, where the biblically faithful position would be, I absolutely believe in the authority of Scripture and the gospel, and I really care about racial injustice in my society, and I want to help heal that. But
because
now it's like,
I believe in
if you believe in racial injustice being a fact, you're accused of not believing Scripture.
Oh, exactly. And I look at the paradigm. I think the fundamentalist modernist analogy is a really interesting and good analogy. I've got one that's like much less intellectual than that. Telephone poles versus crosses. Okay. So this idea of the vertical relationship, and that's the core of everything, is the telephone pole view. The view that says that my vertical relationship with God creates and sustains horizontal obligations is the cross-shaped view. And so what you've got is a lot of people who are essentially advocating for Christians that have become like telephone poles, sort of siloed straight up and down in this personal relationship with Jesus. Whereas the cross-shaped view is, you have that personal relationship with Jesus. You have that vertical component, but that vertical relationship creates the cross-shaped structure where you have to reach out, and you have to, that gospel message and the command, act justly, mandates that we reach out to our neighbor and that we seek to ameliorate injustice in the world. And we're going to have to be really open with each other about, that's complicated. How do you do that? Christians are going to have different views. That's often the start of a conversation, not the end of a conversation. But you see, time and time again, you see a distinction between that telephone pole view and that cross-shaped view. And I think the cross-shaped view is much more fundamentally in line with an understanding of how the gospel compels us to love our neighbor.
No doubt. And in my reading of history, those who advocate for the telephone pole form of Christianity are usually the ones who benefit from the society the way it is and don't want it to change.
That's so true.
So anyway, David, this has been great. Really appreciate your time again for this French Friday, and look forward to next month where we'll talk about maybe an update on the Kennedy case and all the new stuff that's come down the pipe.
Yeah, should be interesting. That I'm going to be listening to that oral argument with keen interest, but mark my words, he's going to win.
Okay, we'll hold you to it. Thanks, David. French Friday is a production of The Holy Post, featuring David French and me, Skye Jitani. Production by Carla Haskins. Production assistance by Julie Betcher. Editing by Jason Rugg. Music and theme song by Phil Vischer. This podcast is made possible by the support of Holy Post listeners like you. To find out how you can become a supporter of the Holy Post and to engage more common good Christian content, visit holypost.com.